let's review autonomic nervous system. But before we talk about that, let's talk about nervous system, which can be divided into two parts: central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. What is central nervous system? It's basically brain and spinal cord, right? And what is peripheral nervous system? Well, everything else. Everything else that is bringing information to the central nervous system or taking information from the central nervous system to like outside, right? So if they are bringing information from the peripheral nervous system, like from the outside to the central nervous system, like to the brain, then those are afferent information or sensory information. But if they're taking information outside from the central nervous system to the outside, then that's like a motor information or efferent. Right. Cool. Now we can break this out even further. So thinking about, let's break down sensory information into two parts. Right. So that could be like something that you're aware of. So like the five senses that you have, which is basically touch, sight, smell, what else? I don't know, sound. Yeah. I feel like I'm missing one. Oh, taste. Right. Fantastic. So these are something that you're like consciously experiencing, right? So these are like sensing things that are you're conscious about. Then there are stuff that you're sensing that, or at least your central nervous system is sensing that you're not aware of. So those are visceral afferent. So that's something like you're not really conscious about. So conscious, I guess. Okay. Those are like detecting things like your carbon dioxide level, oxygen level, oops, like temperature, those things. Okay. We can talk about that later. That's not important. Let's break down your motor part. So motor also can be divided into two parts, technically. One could be your somatic motor system, which basically is like anything that you do voluntarily, like you choose to do it. So for example, like moving your muscles, right? So those would be all voluntary, somatic. There's another part which you are not aware of, like you're not doing it consciously, voluntarily, but signals are going from your central nervous system to the outside to change things in your body. Those are the autonomic nervous system, right? And autonomic nervous system can be broken up into two parts as well: sympathetic and parasympathetic. What's sympathetic? It's just fight and flight, right? So increasing your heart rate, your breathing rate, actually not breathing rate, depth of breathing technically, and converting more glycogen to glucose, all those things that would help you to run from a grizzly bear, for example. And parasympathetic, rest and digest, right? Cool. That's the overview. Great. Let's kind of dig a little bit deeper into the sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? So let me just very quickly draw a spinal cord. Say this is your spinal cord, for example. There are actually different sections anatomically, just makes it easier. So cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral. Okay, cool. And basically, you have cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system, starting from the spinal cord of sympathetic and parasympathetic. So if it's cervical and sacral, those are your preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic. So hard to write in this way, but it's just So if the preganglionic neurons start from these two parts, the sacral and the cervical, then those are parasympathetic ones. And if they start from the thoracic and lumbar, those are sympathetic ones. Okay. Great. Now, the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic would be long. Okay. And then they would synapse with a postganglionic neuron, which is going to be short. Right? What would the preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic release? Like, what neurotransmitter are they releasing? Acetylcholine. And onto, like, let's say, I don't know, this is your receptor. Onto what receptor? Nicotinic? Yep. Okay. And let's talk about the postganglionic neurons. This guy over here, right? What do they release? Let's say this is your target tissue. I don't know, like a heart. Right. So yeah, what would they release? Acetylcholine. Yep. Onto what receptor? Let's say this is your receptor. Muscarinic. Right. So there are two types of acetylcholine, like cholinergic receptor. One is nicotinic, and the other is muscarinic. What's the difference between them? So nicotinic versus muscarinic. So nicotinic is basically ligand-gated receptor. So they have those 5 domains or like subunits, which would form a channel. And if acetylcholine binds to it, the channel opens, allows sodium to get in, right? So allows sodium in, and that would cause depolarization, blah, blah. Okay, muscarinic, they are GPCRs. Okay, so they're not ligand-gated channels, they're metabotropic. Right, and then GPCRs are the ones that are coupled with G proteins, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So that's parasympathetic. Let's talk about sympathetic. Sympathetic preganglionic neurons are actually short. Yep, they don't travel very long. And then the synapse with the postganglionic neurons, which are long. What do the preganglionic neurons release? Like which neurotransmitter? Acetylcholine. Yep. Onto what receptor? Nicotinic. So it's the same, right? And the ganglia is the same. For parasympathetic and sympathetic, they both release acetylcholine and they bind to nicotinic receptor. Great. And this is your postganglionic sympathetic neurons. What would they release? Norepinephrine, right? Norepinephrine or noradrenaline. And they would bind to what receptor? Adrenergic receptors. Well, what adrenergic receptors? Because there are different types, right? So adrenergic receptors, just like muscarinic receptors, are GPCRs as well. And there are different types, right? So then there is like, let's break them down. So alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. Do you need to know details? Probably not now, but like you do have to know details eventually. So let's talk about them very briefly. So alpha 1, where are they found? They're mostly found in blood vessels. We call it blood vessels, a lot of different tissues. And what part of blood vessels? Generally like the smooth muscles, right? So they can lead to contraction of smooth muscles. Right? So it causes the smooth muscle to contract. Awesome. And how do they do that? Basically, alpha 1 is coupled with GQ. And GQ, what does it do? It basically increases activity of phospholipase C, which allows more calcium. And if you've learned about smooth muscles, then that eventually leads to contraction, right? So it won't be important right now, but they would allow blood vessels to contract, so cause vasoconstriction. Okay. Would be very important when we talk about like heart. Okay, great. Alpha 2, not very important, but alpha 2 would be found um, in the GI system, not exactly on the muscle. So that's very important. But they help with autoregulation of the neurons. So basically would decrease neurotransmitter release. Okay. And that's how they kind of cause the GI tract to not contract as much because this is sympathetic. Sympathetic is when you're trying to run from a grizzly bear and you don't probably need to digest at that time, right? So yeah, so and they're coupled with GI, which eventually leads to less CMP. If that this part confuses you, we can talk about that later, just because we haven't learned about autoregulation yet, I guess. So we can talk about that. But anyway, let's move on to beta 1. Beta 1 can be found in the heart. And what do they do? They're coupled with GS and they cause the heart to contract more, right? So, and we can talk about that, but yeah. So we just write increase, heart rate. Yep. Let's talk about beta 2. What does beta 2 does? It's not very important right now, but what they do is they do vessel dilation. So they're also found in the blood vessels, but they do the opposite thing. And they're coupled with GS, and they would increase CAMP. Cool. Important thing to note is for beta 2, it's the epinephrine that binds very well to beta 2, not norepinephrine. Okay, and epinephrine is a hormone that's found in the blood. Awesome. So that's kind of a summary of what's going on in the autonomic nervous system. Now, I'm going to add another part to it just because it's good to contrast and not get confused, is all these things we talked about, the autonomic nervous system, are all part of this section. So that's the motor part of the autonomic nervous system, like something we're not really aware of. Okay, let's talk about where would this part sit, the one about the voluntary. This would be all along the spinal cord as well, but let's just draw that in. So their cell body sits in the ventral part. We don't have to know that, but they only have one neuron, the main neuron, which is the alpha neuron, alpha motor neuron, the somatic motor neuron, whatever you call it, and they will synapse with a muscle, right? So this is your muscle, skeletal muscle, very different from smooth muscles, right? And they would cause, you can like contract the skeletal muscle. What neurotransmitter is being released in this particular junction? Acetylcholine, yep. Onto what receptor? Nicotinic, yep. Awesome. Great. So that's kind of what you need to know overall from this section. Yeah,